All right, so we have another Sargon video. This is a follow-up to the Jess Phillips story. And Sargon is now talking with a woman in public at a table. She asked for his apology. She refuses to accept his apology, basically says she won't accept his apology. Anyway, that stuff goes on. It's kind of stupid. I don't think she's particularly good with logic. But Sargon, he does a very good job. Towards the end, though, around the 30-minute mark, we start getting into the concept of free speech. And that's where Sargon starts to break down a little bit because he doesn't have quite a clear foundation there when it comes to that. And that's where I come in because that's something I'm very clear on. And by the way, I want you to remember, I am better than Sargon. Ooh, should have I said that? I don't know. Anyway, so the idea of threats come up. So the woman says, well, you think you should be able to say anything? And Sargon says, yes. And she says, well, what about a threat to murder? Or something like, what about a threat? Well, here's the key thing. You need to understand what free speech is. And the other thing is there's this term incite, incitement that's used a lot. And that is a very vague term, the way people use it. And it needs to be properly defined. So, for example, we'll handle threats first, and then we'll handle like incitement and those kind of things. And these are examples of things that are not free speech. So in other words, you should be free to say anything as long as it's free speech. Okay? So free speech, you may be insulting somebody, you may be making a statement about anything in the world, any fact, any piece of speech that has no information. It may be music, it may be a movie, it may be 2 + 2 is 4, it may be, as I said, an insult. But where the line is drawn when it's not free speech is when you're initiating force. And that's where Sargon says he's okay with speech, but he's not okay with physical force, and that's where he would draw the line. But there are situations when speech can be used as force. And it's true that these people, like this woman he's arguing with, believe it's like an insult is force, but that's not true. So in order for speech to be turned into force, you would have to use it to enact physical force, or you would have to use it to necessitate physical force, which is an indirect way of enacting it. So let me give you some examples. Let's say you made a communication that detonated a bomb. Is that communication to the bomb free speech? No, of course not. Okay, what if you wrote a letter to someone to contract them to murder someone? Is that free speech? Is only the person who did the murder responsible? No, of course not. Those are not examples of free speech. Let's take another example. Let's make this one a threat. Let's say there is absolute strong evidence that someone says, I'm going to do X, and that X is a violation of someone's rights, and it's said in a context where a reasonable person will believe that it is credible, meaning it's not being said as a joking way. There's significant context to believe it is a credible threat. That is not free speech. Let's give another example. This is not a threat, but this is getting into the area of incitement. Now, incitement is an issue. This is a very exciting issue because particularly in the UK, they have a very bad understanding, or an outright, absolutely incorrect understanding of what incitement is. So incitement, let me start by giving you an example. I think it'll be easiest that way. Let's say, here's one example just off the top of my head. Let's say you're in a crowd and you're standing next to a police officer and you yell out, and there's a guy and he's like raising his hand up, okay? And he's like got a cell phone, and you yell to the police officer, he's got a gun and he's going to shoot you right now. And that police officer looks over in a split second, sees the guy rushing at him, his hands moving up, and you know this guy doesn't have a gun because you were looking at him. The police officer wasn't looking. And he quickly draws his gun and puts a bullet through the head of the guy with the cell phone. That is essentially like an example of that is not free speech. And because what you did is essentially you put the police officer, or it doesn't matter if it's a police officer, but you put an individual in a situation where they essentially believed they had to react in an instant, and there was no time for discussion. These are some key factors. If you said something and there was, say, ample time for discussion and analysis and verification, then we're getting into other details. But you do something like that, like you say, he has a knife. He's going for you. And then maybe somebody will push that guy to the ground, and maybe they'll crack their head open, but it's a lie. If it's a lie, it's a flat out lie. And you said that in order to make the other person take a defensive action that was based on a lie. You essentially, that necessitated that. These are all examples where speech is force. You essentially put a person in a situation where it's merely a means to enacting the force. Okay? So, but an insult is not force. And by the way, as we know, men tend to use physical force, real force, to aggress, as Jordan Peterson talks about so much. But we know women tend to use words. So in a way, it's rather ironic that so many of these women, which are on the left, they think that words are force. If that were true, then all these women who use verbal assaults should be put in prison. And they shouldn't, of course. But, you could say it, not literally, but unfortunately, in the figurative sense, you can assault a person verbally and you cannot commit a crime. And that's how women tend to aggress. But if you assault a person physically, which is how men prefer, sort of, at least biologically in some ancestral sense, to handle things, now you've committed a crime. So there's somewhat of a biological disadvantage in a sense. So a woman could assault a man verbally, and he might want to handle, he doesn't want to come up with an insult, back. So he might want to handle things physically, but of course that's a huge problem with that. So, but that's how the left wants to handle things. So anyway, want to help Sargon out there. So that's 8 minutes. That's enough. Please comment on what you think about the free speech, the way I've explained it. I have a very solid foundation on that issue, very principled and clear understanding. It's something I've studied for years, and I've listened to a lot of people that understand these things in great detail, the philosophy behind it, and the limit. What's the limit to speech? The limit is free speech, and I just explained what free speech is and what free speech is not. So you should be free to speak as long as it is free speech. And those are two different things. Free speech is, I guess, a noun, whereas the freedom to speak would be a verb. And you have to not confuse those. But anyway, please please subscribe, check the bell. I hope I'll bring lots of more content, put some comments. I appreciate everyone listening, and I will try to have some interaction as well in the comments. Thank you very much.